Hello everybody and welcome to a brand new episode of Hidden History. On today's episode, we go through some of the evidence presented in a compelling new Netflix series and give you a preview of the case that Malcolm X, one of America's most famous black political activists, was murdered by the FBI. There was nothing J. Edgar Hoover feared more than a charismatic black radical who could inspire the oppressed not only to protest passively, but to fight back aggressively. And that's why, according to a compelling new series, the FBI had his fingerprints all over Malcolm X's murder. So we're going to take a look at some of the evidence there in a write-up presented by Jacobin Magazine and Joel Whitney. So the only time Malcolm X met Martin Luther King in the U.S. Capitol building in March 1964, he told King, "Now you're going to get investigated." So, I mean, it's not like Martin Luther King wasn't being investigated already, and Malcolm was the only one that the FBI and the United States government and the quote-unquote deep state took a special interest to. But you know, he was very right to say that, and probably was going to be investigated. So by then, King had fought for and gained a place in America's conscience. Malcolm had just fallen out with his teacher in the Nation of Islam, and he hoped to forge a united front of black liberation groups that included a rapprochement with King. This was all about uniting for the final push, bringing together the more radical edges of the black liberation movement and the black empowerment movement with the more mainstream elements, people like Martin Luther King. While Malcolm joked about it to King, the degree to which various agencies were spying on the nations of Islam's most famous apostate escaped even him. In his final months, Malcolm softened his antagonism to King's nonviolent approach while speaking openly to friends of near-constant death threats, a pretty terrible way to live your life, always feeling like you have to look over your shoulder from an entity as large and as all-powerful as the United States government. A series out this winter on Netflix suggests the role United States law enforcement officials played in Malcolm's murder has been understated and gets closer than ever to laying the blame at the feet of the U.S. government itself. Originally shown at Fusion, Who Killed Malcolm X features Abdur Rahman Muhammad, a journalist, a father, and a Malcolm admirer who, over 6 episodes, guides the viewer through his decades-long investigation to reveal that 2 of the 3 men convicted for Malcolm's murder were innocent, and why, really, this never saw the light of day. And of course, you know I had to play the trailer.
We're not brutalized because we're Muslims. We're brutalized because we are black people in America.
The power of this man's courage to say this stuff. It changed the entire trajectory of my life.
He was becoming a figure that transcended the Nation of Islam.
It was politics that really started the rift between Malcolm and the nation.
No, the white man is the greatest hate teacher that ever wrote this.
The FBI was definitely afraid of someone like Malcolm X.
What kind of democracy is that?
People had to start wondering if something happens to Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm becomes the leader, it's over for all of us.
And just then the gunfire went off.
Malcolm's death never sat right with me.
The investigation was a failure.
Asking who's guilty is a dangerous question to ask.
What is the real story?
It's in the history book. Leave it there. Leave it alone.
Elijah Muhammad told everybody, do not raise a hand against Malcolm X.
He didn't have to give the order. Someone would take care of it.
The FBI should have known.
Why doesn't someone want to get to the bottom of this?
They never had any intentions of seriously investigating that assassination.
That is my mission. I'm not going to stop until I get justice. Because the official count of who killed Malcolm X, it's not true.
So there you have it, that trailer, and that is set to come out, I believe, in this winter, I believe. This is going to be February 7th, worldwide release. And this was this? Okay. Hold on. Yeah, so this was out February 7th, 2020. And what we're going to do is pretty much through what will be probably 2 episodes here, go through some of the cases that it makes. So he goes on to show pretty much one of the key big assertions that the documentarian Abdur Rahman Muhammad makes is that the FBI knew that the men two of the three men who convicted Malcolm, who they convicted for Malcolm's murder, were innocent. And he goes on to show the FBI knew this, but did not submit evidence to exonerate the men. During a key episode, he meditates on why. Taking his questions to Nation of Islam veterans and Pulitzer Prize-winning and in-house FBI historians, Muhammad finally establishes that this oversight could not have been accidental. As a protagonist and guide through the annals of Malcolm X revisionism, Muhammad is so convincing that Malcolm's murder case has been reopened. Malcolm's murder turns 55 this year. Timed with the anniversary, the series includes among its experts the scholar Peniel Joseph, whose The Sword and the Shield, and a side-by-side biography of Malcolm and Martin Luther King came out in early April. While the Netflix series emphasizes the important relationship between Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad, Joseph provides context around the other important relationship with King that should have been allowed to ripen further. Though it was frequently antagonistic, the relationship bore features of an unspoken collaboration and recognition that, probably could benefit some in the modern left-wing movement today, that while they were fighting for things in different ways, they were still fighting for the same thing. This relationship also kept FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover up at night. He worried about a charismatic figure who might, quote, unify and electrify the black nationalist movement, let alone these two black radicals. Because, again, many people don't appreciate the fact that Martin Luther King was a radical at the time. The idea that they may work together was just absolutely horrifying to someone like an FBI, like J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI as a whole. Abdur Rahman Muhammad is a journalist and a proud working man who leads tours of Lower Manhattan. On camera, he looks like a business casual-clad bureaucrat with an affable face, a wry smile, and a warm, steady voice. As a teen, he was targeted by police for being out with a white girlfriend. Police insulted him, took him on a ride around the city, mocked, and threatened him. It made him distrustful of police, an admirer of Malcolm X. I became a black militant activist who wasn't going to take this shit anymore. He was, in the truest sense of the word, really, brought to radicalization through, the term that everyone loves to say nowadays, lived experience. Like, he didn't come to this stuff through reading it in a book like, a lot of these experiences I haven't had, but, I'm kind of very sympathetic because, I think it's just what's right. But in this situation, Abdur Rahman Muhammad, he really felt the boot of the modern-day police system all throughout his life. He never really believed the story on how Malcolm was killed. Muhammad did. Or didn't, I should say. Much later, he started to dig. Soon his files were rich, and his work was featured in A Life of Reinvention, a 2011 biography of Malcolm by the late Manning Marable. No one alive has done more to solve Malcolm's killing than Abdur Rahman, says Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Garrow. The official story of Malcolm X's killing is that he and his teacher, the spiritual leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, sometimes known as the Messenger, had a falling out. The inciting incident was a remark Malcolm made after the Kennedy assassination. Muhammad had asked him not to weigh in or criticize the slain president, and he grew increasingly wary of Malcolm's political punditry. At the end of his speech, a week after the assassination, however, someone in the audience asked Malcolm's opinion. Given the state of the violence the United States has presided over at home and around the world, he famously said the assassination was like chickens coming home to roost. Recognizing Kennedy's popularity, Elijah Muhammad suspended or muzzled Malcolm for 19 days. Nation of Islam members started to take sides, and the feud escalated with Elijah and Muhammad and Malcolm engaged in a war of words, including threats from the messenger, often coded in religious imagery. So this guy, he was the big poobah of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm kind of was becoming a separate star, a separate power source, a real power base that was in many ways transcending the Nation of Islam structure, as you heard in that little trailer there, that was being built up by the messenger, or Elijah Muhammad. So on February 21st, 1965, Malcolm was shot at close range at New York City's Audubon Ballroom in front of his wife, Betty Shabazz, and his children. The multiple assailants fired at him. The wounds from a sawed-off shotgun used by a man in a long coat who had appeared from the front row was ruled to be the cause of the death. Another man with a shotgun, Talmadge Hayer from Newark, New Jersey, from the New York, New Jersey mosque known to NOI followers as Mosque Number 25, was apprehended at the crime scene after he was shot in the leg and caught in a melee. Police pulled him from the crowd and eventually confessed to being one of the co-conspirators. Two of the other men, Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson, were arrested. Both of them maintained their innocence, and police had no physical evidence against them, but their weaker cases were bundled with Hayers, and they were convicted, all three given 20 years to life. Through a series of files debunking the thin case against Johnson and Butler, Abdurrahman and Muhammad alleged the three men were telling the truth. Two were innocent, and one, Hayer, who confessed, was guilty. So why the other two men, and what is the association here? What's the thing that those two men have in common that the guy who actually confessed doesn't have? The popular story of Malcolm X's murder, Abdurrahman Muhammad asserts in the first episode of Who Killed Malcolm X, is untrue. He comes really right through off the bat and kind of says it. And Muhammad's revisionist version starts with J. Edgar Hoover, the professional suppressor of left-wing radicals, which is really something that is incredibly true in terms of if you look at the real function of the FBI and the CIA over the years, FBI kind of doing it internally where the CIA did it internationally, is kind of how we see these threatening movements, these movements that threaten in any way U.S. interests, whether they be mostly left-wing, in some cases, especially abroad, just purely nationalists and wanting to assert a country for themselves. What the FBI and CIA have done for American power interests have suppressed these movements, neutralized them, and really surveilled them from day one. And in the case of J. Edgar Hoover and the Black Liberation Movement, he had one particular fear. He was terrified of a black messiah and once insisted that there must be a goal of preventing a coalition of militant black nationalist groups, preventing the rise of a figure who can unify and electrify the black nationalist movement, along with preventing militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability and by discrediting them to the community. An internal FBI memo to that end asked what was being done to stop Malcolm X. The NYPD knew the threats on Malcolm's life. They heard about it at a time, but it didn't have a security detail checking for weapons at the door of the Audubon Ballroom the night Malcolm would speak. No uniformed police officers came inside the venue to guard the famed leader during his talk. Instead, the NYPD stationed cops on the roof and on the sidewalk in front of the building. The lackadaisical attitude didn't end there. When the police arrived to investigate the scene, they reportedly sauntered through the ballroom as if on a Sunday stroll. After Hayer's capture, eyewitness accounts corroborated that there were 5 gunmen, one of whom, according to the series, may have slipped away in the melee. Somehow, after they captured Hayer and then Johnson and Butler, the police arbitrarily reduced the number of suspects from 5 to 3, a decision they never explained. And of course, eyewitness accounts can be unreliable, but if you have multiple eyewitness accounts saying that there are 5 gunmen, would you at least not want to investigate the fact that and really disprove the fact that there are 3 instead of 5, and prove the fact that there were 3 instead of 5, and disproving the 5 gunman theory? Aside from taking a few photographs of the bullet holes in the podium and in the chest and chin of Malcolm himself, the police barely secured the room or its evidence that night, and they allowed the owners to hold a dance. After the rift over Malcolm's Kennedy comments, Malcolm had written apologetically to his teacher but received no answer. The series asserts that the FBI had been exploiting that schism in the months leading up to the killing. They fed stories to the media about the rift, and they may have used the informants to spread rumors about each figure's animosity towards each other. So if you're seeing 2 isolated forces, 2 forces that hypothetically should be on the same side but are coming divergent, and you want them to diverge to your advantage, they're not really communicating to each other. And if Malcolm sees in the press that, Elijah Muhammad is leaking this, and vice versa, it's only going to widen the rift between the two. The sheer number of informants known to have penetrated the Nation of Islam created paranoia. One of the explicit goals of the FBI's COINTELPRO, or counterintelligence program, which spied on progressive and dissident groups, pitting them against each other. John Ali, the national secretary based in the organization's Chicago mansion, has been frequently accused of having been an informant as well as having stoked hatred between the two former collaborators. He responded to filmmakers' questions about these accusations with odd phrases like, "I could have," while insisting the Bureau didn't accept him as an informant. Some interviews featured the affable Abdur Rahman Muhammad asking witnesses questions, nodding along, and then raising his brow before a follow-up. After casually befriending witnesses who tell him they saw it as a pretty much closed case, he asked, but how could justice be done if two innocent black men served time? Series director Rachel Dresden conducts another kind of interview. Both interviewers are virtuosic at drawing out their subjects. But Dresden's interviews are filmed more like police interrogations, the camera on the subject directly, while Muhammad's feel like eavesdropping on a conversation. So kind of playing the good cop, bad cop approach there. Her interview with Cory Booker, who is an eerie and incentral tie due to the presumptive killer through a campaign video, is gripping. Pretty much that tie is that for the people that the documentary points the finger to appeared in Cory Booker's campaign ad for his mayoral campaign in Newark. These are 4 Nation of Islam members who appeared in the campaign video. While files must be examined, Muhammad either skims them with another historian or archivist, or he points to key sentences that loom on screen. We learn that Johnson was arrested as the trigger man, for instance, despite not matching the description of the real killer in an FBI file. Episode 1's end with Abdur Rahman Muhammad finding a file describing the shotgun shooter as stocky, dark-skinned, and coming from the New York Mosque, none of which characterized Johnson, who was light-skinned, and from Malcolm's Harlem Mosque. Why did the police miss this? Again, a key question that, can't really fully be answered that this documentary raises. From there, the series turns into a meditation on the FBI surveillance through COINTELPRO, one of the most pervasive programs throughout the post-World War II Cold War era. Garrow tells viewers how thoroughly the Bureau infiltrated the Nation of Islam, citing multiple high-ranking paid human informants in the leadership. Could it have been, he asked in Focus Draw, that the FBI paid informants were involved in Malcolm X's murder? Almost certainly. The Nation of Islam's need for revenge, the series posits, may have been the cover for members who joined as informants, or who, thanks to money offered after they joined, turned dirty while rising into the leadership. Soon we see that the need for revenge itself may have been manipulated. Who egged on who? Who was manipulating the rift over the Kennedy comments that so drove Malcolm X apart from Elijah Muhammad? While the FBI surveilled Malcolm, the NYPD sent the Bureau of Special Services Investigation, known as BOSSI or the Red Squad, to his rallies and to record his calls. BOSSI was effectively a police unit made over as aspiring. One of his agents boasts how he knew Malcolm's habits so well that they switched on their wiretap on the second ring when Malcolm would always pick up, so he wouldn't hear the click. Tony Buzza, one of the more wryly, unapologetic BOSSI officers in the series, confesses, "I don't think he understood that we were tapping his wire and listening to the tapes. Did we intrude into his privacy? Yes, but I was all right with it. If Malcolm spoke before a broader audience, then FBI agents, all white, could attend. If not, they found black men in the streets and met with them in movie theaters to arrange the surveillance or to trade information. They were all over him." A series like this, or Errol Morris's Wormwood, also on Netflix, forces you to admit that paranoia as a mode isn't so quaint or paranoid after all. So it was for Malcolm, who began addressing his crowds beginning with Mr. Moderator, friends, enemies. While the audience looked around at everyone and laughed uneasily, Malcolm would continue, "Everyone is here." And he was right. In The Sword and the Shield, Joseph quotes Malcolm as admitting that when speaking publicly, I guessed which were FBI faces in the audience or other types of agents. So he kind of knew that he was being surveilled, but he just couldn't really do anything to stop it, because that's how all-encompassing the surveillance was, and I'm sure they surveilled him in ways that he was unaware of at the time. In 1962, FBI memos showed the FBI knew about Elijah Muhammad's multiple extramarital affairs, often with underage girls, including several with whom he conceived children. Agents schemed to send anonymous letters to his wife, Clara Muhammad. This was stirred into the cauldron to poison the two men's relationship. To encounter his teacher's rampant hypocrisy would have offended the happily married father, especially as he bristled at the muzzle against his own outspokenness. So, I mean, he's got a point there. Like, what is the basis of suspending him for these comments when you're violating key tenets of your own religion as the messenger? You know, anyone who gives themselves the name the messenger or something like that is probably going to be a pretty sketchy person in the first place. One event during the Kennedy administration offers a window into the growing conflict. In 1962, Malcolm's friend, a Nation of Islam member named Ronald Stokes, was shot and killed by LAPD. The incident marked the only time his wife, Betty Shabazz, recalls seeing Malcolm cry. Footage from a speech Malcolm made in the aftermath of the killing shows the activist with blown-up photographs of the scene, one featuring the back of Stokes' head with a bullet hole in it. An FBI memo describes his full-throated denunciation, which compared the LAPD's actions to Gestapo-like tactics. Subject to opening statement was that, quote, seven innocent unarmed black men were shot down in cold blood by Police Chief William J. Parker's Los Angeles City Police. The subject then referred to the incident as one of the most ferocious, inhuman atrocities ever inflicted in a so-called democratic and civilized society. And subject referred to Stokes' murder as a brutal and cold-blooded murder by Parker's well-armed stormtroopers. When Muhammad cautioned Malcolm to de-escalate, Malcolm reportedly felt shame that the Nation of Islam wouldn't stand up to defend its own members. Part of why Muhammad wanted to keep Malcolm from going too far, however, was because the NOI had lucrative commercial interests in Los Angeles that funded its ministerial work and enriched Muhammad and his family, and a war with the LAPD would jeopardize business. So there you see the big rift from them, not perhaps all manipulated, was that they just had different perspectives. They had different goals in what they were trying to accomplish. One was really purely more ministerial and, you know, more corrupt and more secretly debauched, while Malcolm seemed to be, I mean, clearly was much more focused on activism than Muhammad ever was. The series happens to be quite informative on this and other details, but Joseph gives broader context about the questions around Muhammad's political outspokenness and Malcolm's political outspokenness and Muhammad's, shall we say, business affairs and affairs of the sexual variety. Malcolm had always been outspoken politically, and it helped boost the organization's members, spurring publicity and filling seats. For that, Muhammad would have been grateful. Malcolm was often booked to speak with Elijah Muhammad, the genius orator and acolyte warming up, as it were, for the messenger himself as the main event. But Muhammad had a lung condition, and as the 1960s progressed, Muhammad missed events due to illness. In his many appearances before the media or a live audience, Malcolm was often tasked with explaining how the Nation of Islam's policy of separatism was distinct from segregation. Pundits expected to discredit Malcolm and the Nation by likening separatism to reverse racism, but it had little to do with accepting segregation as it was, Malcolm explained. Segregation was the control of black people, he said, while the Nation's separatism was the voluntary promotion of self-determination for a black community in search of its own place in the world, pretty much saying that the black community should have its own say in what it wants to do with themselves if it really wants to be truly free and independent. So, to Malcolm, King's gospel of nonviolence was a bargaining from a position of weakness, akin to asking white people's permission for freedom rather than taking it. Malcolm saw King's bids for integration as admitting King's inferiority, because he's also admitting that he wants to become a part of the superior society. So really, also a fundamental, like, between the two, as we see between the three men, Muhammad, Malcolm, and King, a fundamental difference in worldviews, at least how the one viewed the other, especially with Malcolm and Martin, how there was really some pretty fundamental differences on what they wanted the end result to be. And this whole notion of Malcolm seeing Martin as wanting to join a kind of superior society, like he was kissing up to the white power of America, as a pretty fundamental difference. Like that, like it's pretty hard to reconcile a strategy and worldview difference that is that fundamental. Well before his comments on Kennedy, but especially after his falling out with the Nation, Malcolm circled around the idea of a broader coalition. He interspersed invitations to work alongside King with a steady barrage of critiques of nonviolence as ineffectual. Perhaps this is why King tended to decline or not answer Malcolm's invitations, as well as the 1961 Freedom Rally in Harlem. Nevertheless, The two leaders engage in fascinating indirect conversation, which Joseph draws out well in a tandem biography feeling remarkably like full biographies of each. A virtuoso at articulating undercurrents of black power, including the equally meticulous biography of Stokely Carmichael, this book Stokely, A Life in 2014, Joseph adroitly places the two leaders in contrast to each other as a contrapuntal duet. This duet demonstrates the awful silence we would feel, which is one of their voices missing, as was exemplified with Malcolm's death 3 years before King's, let alone both after 1968. The most fascinating part of their joint performance was how Malcolm was constantly using his rhetoric to amplify the terms in which King could work, and vice versa. So this is very interesting because it kind of plays into the same debate that we saw in the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. Many people said that this wasn't what Martin Luther King would have wanted. Any type of violence, any type of aggression by black protesters would be a threat to the movement, would be a step back. Just look at the incredibly successful Martin Luther King. And no, the kind of, I would argue, more historically accurate counter-argument was Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were in a symbiotic relationship. Malcolm X was not parasitic on the movement, but in fact allowed King to thrive, and King, in turn, allowed the same for Malcolm X. So if one fought for black citizenship and the other fought for black dignity, their disagreement over nonviolence was a disagreement merely over tactics, Malcolm said in a period of softening towards King. And their socially distant partnership, something small might echo from one to the other. First, Malcolm, as around the 1962 Stokes killing, and then King, as in Birmingham, might take turns calling police methods Gestapo-like. Malcolm obviously followed King's movements and speeches, and vice versa. King sometimes responded to Malcolm's speeches the very same day. Malcolm would at times even debate King through a proxy, like Bayard Rustin, and one of the lead organizers on the March on Washington. The two would joust ruthlessly on stage, but they enjoyed themselves so much they soon agreed to take the routine on the road. Their first debate at Howard University impressed students like the young Carmichael and faculty alike. Rustin accused the Muslims of having no political, social, or economic program, but Malcolm's talk of racial pride, political self-determination, and black solidarity motivated a generation of young activists to imbibe a large quantities of black history, to investigate the significance of African decolonization and reimagine the meaning of American identity within Western culture. African American identity within Western culture. And that is really, as much as there is some kind of criticism for the lack of kind of economic vision or really what day-to-day life would look for black Americans staying in America, Malcolm in turn provided the other piece of that puzzle, like what socially and culturally it means to be an African American in the West, was something that he really tried to sort out in his speeches and his philosophy. As for King and Kennedy, King had been waiting for a meeting for the first 7 months of Kennedy's term, and whether King saw it or not, Malcolm's criticism of Kennedy gave King cover for his own. Malcolm also knew that the original vision of the March on Washington, which A. Philip Randolph first imagined decades earlier in the 1940s, was more radical, focused on shutting down the Capitol. Malcolm claimed that when the president saw that he couldn't stop it, he joined it. Once it had Kennedy's blessing, Malcolm felt it had become too timid, less focused on stopping traffic, stopping work, and flexing black power, concerning itself with providing places to urinate and faint. Before gathering of newspaper editors, Kennedy denigrated Muslims as a den for extremists. Instead of attacking the Ku Klux Klan and the White Citizens Council, said Malcolm, Kennedy attacked Islam, a religion. And Malcolm also did blame Kennedy for the assassination of the Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, who was killed just days before Kennedy's inauguration, or for the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in April of Kennedy's first term. This is a whole nother story there. Regardless, Malcolm's quip about Kennedy and violence had more behind it than the random act of cruelty it was portrayed as. So, yeah, it was a very kind of prescient and very controversial critique that he had there. It was of the fact that, yeah, Kennedy is starting violence all over the world, causing chaos all over the world, and here at home, brutally oppressing citizens and people that he purports to represent, and saying he's doing it in the name of, a new America for a better world and all that stuff. But it is hard to say that, and then, sometimes what can I say? The chickens do come home to roost. But yeah, how he was killed, why he was killed, that is obviously a whole other story. We talked a little bit about that in our last season, so you can go and exploring that, but there's still so much more to talk about in that area, and there's still so much more to talk about in the life of Malcolm X. We are about halfway through our kind of a summary of this, but we will finish up with this. According to the docuseries John L. Lee, Elijah Muhammad's secretary, the believed informant, called Chicago and reported Malcolm to the messenger after he made the chicken roosting comment. Newspapers and TV networks distorted the quip, made an ironic indignation over the United States hypocrisy, framing it as if Malcolm had expressed joy over Kennedy's death. Malcolm had worked hard to make peace with Muhammad, but his letters of humility and regret to Muhammad were interpreted by the messenger's children and heirs to his empires, or others who would have been intercepted by the messenger's children and heirs to his empire, or others who would have been threatened by Malcolm, so he was suspended. So pretty much the children, through some reason, were probably pretty key barriers in the way of Malcolm, who made real efforts to make peace with Muhammad after those Kennedy comments, so he was suspended because of that. They didn't really have the full peace negotiation that they wanted, which is interesting. In the aftermath of the incident, the press continued to refer to Malcolm as Muhammad's heir apparent. This annoyed Malcolm, as he knew it would only heighten the animosity of the actual heirs. Worried about the loss of his livelihood through an organization he had built and expanded like no one else, Malcolm spent their winter correcting interviewers, saying that he was never the heir apparent, emphasizing that he was suspended over his own actions and knew the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had taught him everything he knew. It was a real moment of humility for a firebrand activist and preacher with a touch of survival instinct. 2 months in the rift, FBI visited Malcolm at his home. He welcomed them in. In an exploratory interview, they offered to pay him to inform on the Nation of Islam. They spoke in tentative tones of records he may have access to. They were there to test the psychology of Malcolm during the rift, a rift these agents had quietly curated. Denying he had such access, Malcolm had secretly recorded the two agents, one of whom was named Fulton, who speaks to Dresden but refuses to show his face on camera. Money brings out the information, Fulton told Malcolm, instantly realizing he'd erred. You insult my intelligence, Malcolm objected. In fact, you insult your own. You wouldn't know in advance what I'm going to say. He emphasized that he was no quisling or fink, that no government agent should ever expect information from me. One of the agents described Malcolm during the visit as nice and courteous, but not too cooperative. Unfortunately, other people were. That's all we have for part 1 on this week's Hidden History. Come back as we tell more about the story of Malcolm X.